Let me welcome all of you. We have an honor to have today with us Professor John Keane, and Professor John Keane will be formally introduced by Radosław Markowski. I would like just to say a few words how proud we are here that you came to us and to tell us how democracies die, fast and slow. Let me say a few words in the name of one co-organizers, which is the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences. We organized this together with the SWPS University. And I think that, you know, for many, many years, we have been teaching and learning ourselves how democracies were emerging, fast and slow. Actually, we are here in the round table. Round table is a symbol of Polish road to democracy, which has been sort of, let's say, negotiated way. And I believe that the question, to what extent the way democracies are emerging is dependent or influences the way how durable they are, might be also of interest to today's audience. Whether negotiated democracy is more durable than democracy which comes out as a result of a revolution, this we don't know. However, we have learned that democracies, although in our region of Europe are not dying very, very fast, they are slowly more and more endangered. And autocracies, particularly one autocracy, very close to Poland, are becoming more and more aggressive and engaged in wars. So that is why I think learning what makes democracies more or less durable, what makes them dying or lasting, and finally, what makes them dying fast or slow. These are crucial questions for today's, not only for today's academia, but also for today's societies and general public. So I'm very, very pleased that we will have opportunity to listen to this topic today. We are doing a lot of research in this institute. Mostly, we are more on the side of society than politics itself, but we studied during our engagement in various research projects, Polpan, headed by Professor Słomczyński, European Social Survey, headed in Poland by Michał Kotnarowski, how people use, or sometimes, or even more than sometimes, unfortunately, how they don't use democracies, because democracy without social participation does not function. It's also dying, maybe slowly, but it is dying. So I believe that all these issues might be addressed today as well. And now I would like to pass the mic to Radosław Markowski.
Thank you. So first, let me mention how we proceed from here on. I'll try to do justice whom we have here in about 5 minutes. Then we will have the presentation by our guest. And after that, we'll have a short postscriptum by Michał Kotnarowski on the case we are locked in. That is the Polish case, the Polish problems with democracy. And then, of course, questions and comments and quarrels will follow. We are not alone. There are, I'm informed, approximately 200 people watching us on the web. So they should also be able to ask questions after. So without any further delay, let me just mention a few of the many, many things that John Keane has been doing during his line. In his official short bio, it says born in Southern Australia, whatever it means. You can be more specific on that. Then there are lots of books. First of all, let me also mention that there is a very good page, johnkeane.net, if I'm not mistaken, where you can see all the books, all reviews, blogs, comments, YouTube presentations and others. But his major books are The Life and Death of Democracy, 2009, Democracy and Media Decadence, which is 2013. Then a book, When Trees Fall, Monkeys Scatter, 2017, and The New Despotism, 2020. He contributed to many journals, among the New York Times, Decide, Financial Times, Guardian, and many, many other. He was ranked by El País recently as one of the greatest theorists of political systems. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation speaks of him as one of Australia's great intellectual exports. He was nominated for the 2021 Balzan Prize, Italy, and the Holmberg Prize, Norway, for outstanding global contributions to the human sciences. His latest book, The Shortest History of Democracy, 2022, so far published, translated into 15 languages. I hope Polish editors will soon also knock at your door. Yeah, there is much, much more I could say about John Keane. Among the things that from time to time pop up in his presentations is that he's very active publicly. He is running a center for the study of democracy in Sydney, and the rest is now in your hands and tongue. I don't know whether you...
Yeah. Do I need to use this microphone? Okay, so then yeah, sure. So, oh, okay, fine. Gives me more power. Dzień dobry, Pani I Panowie I Obywatele. Dziękuję bardzo to Professor Ichard, also to Professor Markowski and to Professor Narowski. I wanted to say thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. It's a great honor. The topic that I've chosen to speak about today is how democracies die, the different tempos by which their substance and their spirit suffer, what is called and what I'm going to call democide, and what is lost when democide happens. Running through my remarks, you will soon see, is the precept that the renewal of the democratic imagination is badly needed in these troubled times. Pani Panowie, the writing is on democracy's wall. The great democratic revolution of modern times, as Tocqueville called it, seems again to be stalling. There are plenty of positive countertrends. Think of, for example, very well-run, democratically organized cities. But the fugitive spirit, it seems to me, is on the run with the disastrous experiences of the 1920s and 1930s in mind. Many observers are today inclined to say that something like an anti-democratic counter-revolution is happening, and probably on a global scale. The trends come to us, as we all know, through daily breaking news. Widening gaps between rich and poor, anxious middle classes, angry underclasses who are convinced that democracy is a facade for rule by the rich and the powerful, neoliberalism, greedy banks, surveillance capitalism, pestilence, populism, demagogues, growing intolerance of others' opinions, resurgent racism, nationalism, xenophobia, precarity, inflation, lying, scheming politicians, untrustworthy political parties, political corruption, sex scandals, misogyny, domestic violence, guns, street shootings, media untruths, destructive metaverse wars, weird weather, the extinction of species, floods, fires, droughts, crop failures, famine, talk of the decline of the West, China, Russian despotism. Things are indeed serious. Not since actually the mid-20th century has, I think, there been so much political trouble and so much anxiety about this trouble. Writings and talks about the decline of democracy are becoming something like a craft industry. This is refusing to obey. Maybe I could just ask you to click to the next slide. Thank you. Whatever one thinks of books of this kind, I'll say a few words about David Runciman's How Democracy Ends. They have, I think, the commentaries, the books, the essays, the lectures on the decline of democracy have functioned to undermine settled certainties. They're being replaced by a mix of reactions among scholars of democracy. So far, what is striking is that the outright rejection of democratic principles by intellectuals of the kind that last took place on a large scale during the 1920s and 30s hasn't happened. I'm thinking here, for example, of H.G. Wells, who at a summer school in Oxford in 1935 tells his students that what is needed in the age of collectivism is sophisticated fascism. I mean, this was a trend that happened during those decades where intellectuals, many intellectuals, defected from democracy. That seems to me not yet to be happening, but it is worthwhile looking at some early signs of this disaffection. One example is David Runciman, professor of politics. Actually, he is a Viscount. His correct name is Viscount David Runciman, whose two books, The Confidence Trap and How Democracy Ends, display a kind of reluctance about democracy. Roughly, the arguments are that, by Runciman, is that democracy is poor at anticipating crises. Democracies take forever, as he puts it, to read writings on the wall. Democracies, he argues, are crippled by their bad habit of procrastination, and for that they earn his rebuke. I quote, "Democracies survive their mistakes, so the mistakes keep coming." This ongoing process, according to Runciman, of democracy, the successes and the failures, creates conditions for repeated failures. It's Samuel Beckett, try again, fail better, minus the gallows humor. At one point, Runciman draws on 1920s analogies, for example, from Spengler, organic metaphors, where he says that democracies today are in what he calls miserable middle age and trapped in a drawn-out demise that will surely end unhappily. I quote, "Western democracy will survive its midlife crisis. With luck, it will be a little chastened by it. It is unlikely to be revived by it. This is not, after all, the end of democracy, but this is how democracy ends." You will soon see that I'm not much impressed or persuaded by this kind of melancholia that you can find in Runciman's work. My concern is actually, if we could have the next slide, please, my concern is to renew the spirit of a scholar in the mid-1930s, Karl Löwenstein, a scholar who emigrated to America under pressure from Nazism, who coined the phrase militant democracy, who pointed out that it's very important for Democrats to think clearly about how democracies perish and to prevent democide by getting tough with the enemies of democracy. I want to develop this idea in this lecture to say that knowledge of how democide happens is of rising importance. I concentrate on this topic not because I have some kind of death wish or because I have some morbid fascination with morbidity. Rather, my idea in this lecture is that paying attention to how democracies die, fast and slow, can serve as something of an early warning detector, a means of spotting the first symptoms of democide so that citizens and their representatives can better protect democracy from its foes. Fashionable today, if we could have please the next slide, fashionable today is what I want to call catastrophist understandings, or if you like, theories of interpretations of the sudden death of democracies. They are highly fashionable. The catastrophist approach, let's call it, portrays the death of democracy as a great drama. It's as if time speeds up. Things familiar suddenly fall apart. Under pressure, givens cease to be given. Great uncertainty grips how things are. Established ways of handling power crumble. History suddenly happens. This sudden death interpretation has a long and venerable ancestry stretching back to ancient Greece, where you may know there were many commentators who observed the sudden collapse of democracies in that period of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Events such as the 30 tyrants of period in Athens, 404, 403 BCE, when for 8 bloody months, democracy, the Athenian democracy, was subjected to the cruel rule of a committee of 30 oligarchs, a reign of terror, the disarming and exiling of hundreds of citizens, the murder of resident aliens, and the rounding up and execution of many prominent Democrats, such as Androcles and Cleophon. Catastrophist thinking about how living democracies suddenly miss their step, stumble, and collapse to the ground, democide, are still very much in fashion. For instance, many observers are interpreting the January the 6th events in the United States in this way. They see it as an organized, violent attack on the Capitol that was part of a broader scheme to overturn an election result directed from the top by a defeated president and his buddies. There are many other examples stretching back in time. I mentioned them in passing. Israel's crushing of the electoral victory of Hamas in the Palestinian legislative elections in 2006. A military coup d'etat that ousted the government of Yingluck Shinawatra in Thailand in 2014. The overthrow of a caretaker Greek government on the eve of elections in 1967 by a regime led by colonels. If I may have please the next slide, the 1973 military coup d'etat against the Allende government in, this looks very unfamiliar, the Allende government in Chile. This is the presidential, or was the presidential palace. You may remember in that moment, this was an episode of great high political drama when the president of a democratically elected socialist government bid farewell to his country in a live radio broadcast, then took his life as troops, helicopter gunships, and Air Force jets bombarded the presidential palace. Past cases of the sudden death of democracy are also said to include Hitler's invasion and refashioning of the provinces of Bohemia and Moravia, turning them into a German protectorate under the leadership of a Reichsprotektor. The follow-up invasions of Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and of course the March on Rome a century ago in October 1922, when streets filled with black-shirted paramilitaries and supporters of the National Fascist Party celebrated with bread and wine and songs to declare the victory of Mussolini as Prime Minister of Italy. How are we to assess this catastrophist sudden death view of the end of democracies? My own The Life and Death of Democracy, mentioned by Professor Markowski, records numerous cases of the sudden death of democracy, very often in context of war. Evidence cited by Levitsky and Ziblatt suggests that during the past generation, around 3/4 of power-sharing democracies met their end in this quick death way. In support of this catastrophist thesis, it's also doubtlessly clear that democracies, the impression that democracies naturally die suddenly has been amplified by media platforms, spreading breaking news stories crafted by journalists hungry for big audiences. This coverage of how democracies die suddenly reinforces the credibility of the catastrophe interpretation, whose other merit, I think, is to serve as a timely reminder of the great fragility of democracy. Above all, the way building a democracy, which can take at least a lifetime or longer, is a much tougher task than its destruction, which can be destroyed, as Germans would say, in ein Augenblick, in the blink of an eye. But the catastrophist approach, I want to argue this afternoon, is of limited value in making sense of democide. We're going to see that democide can happen more or less quickly, more or less slowly. These, if you were to speak in physics terms, democracy is subject, democracies in difficulty are subject to what physicists call time dilation. That is, they are subject to different tempos, and these tempos need to be identified and understood, not only because they underscore the descriptive analytic point that there's no single way in which democracies are destroyed or come by accident or design to sabotage themselves. There are also strategic and normative implications of thinking of the destruction of democracies or the self-destruction of democracies according to multiple tempos. We can say that since the passing away of the spirit and substance of democracy can and does happen in different tempos, and since there's therefore no single iron law of democide, the friends of militant democracy, as Löwenstein called the task, must learn to deal with its degradation and work for its renewal in nuanced and plural ways. Let me now, secondly, turn to another interpretation, which I want to call gradualism. The key fact is, long ago emphasized by Juan Linz, the Spanish Yale University political scientist and other scholars, is that the death of democracy by gradual cuts is much more common than catastrophists suppose. That is to say, high-level dramas that unfold allegrissimo and furioso are only one of the rhythms of democide. It turns out that the death of democracy can happen lentissimo, slowly, through protracted, steady accumulations of high-level political grievances and knife-edge maneuverings. If we analyze cases of democide, they evidently are they evidently are subject to these more gradual decomposition, processes of decomposition. Consider, for example, recent events in Burkina Faso. Yes, this is a second military coup government announcing its victory on television just a few weeks ago. Burkina Faso was expected to make some kind of transition to power-sharing democracy. At least a third of the country is under opposition armed rule. 1.5 million people have been forced from their homes. There have been repeated mutinies, and presidents have been removed, and 2 coups d'etats have happened. If you look at the dynamics of the Burkina Faso context, you see that the Juan Lintz interpretation better applies. There is no instant moment where the quest for power-sharing constitutional government dies. It's rather a slower accumulation of events and mishaps and deliberate efforts at sabotage. One could also understand Poland in the 1920s in this way. You know much better than me this character. This was a period after World War I when Poland was, the whole situation in Poland was a tale of the gradual destruction of parliamentary democracy, a period punctuated by the strains of building an independent state, border wars, economic hardships, bitter political rivalries, unstable coalition governments, the assassination of the first Polish president, Narutowicz, a coup d'etat engineered by Pilsudski in May 1926, who then, with the backing of the police and the army, big business and landowner groups, ruled by decree and rigged elections until his death a decade later. In each of these cases, past and present, punctuated by occasional cataclysms, democide proved to be a protracted process, painfully drawn out, tortoise-paced, subject to flip-flops, breakthroughs, reversals, and changes of fortune. According to this gradualist explanation, this second explanation, democratic breakdowns are typically over-determined, the outcome of multiple intersecting political developments. This gradualist explanation shifts attention, rightly in my view, from the moments of high drama towards the messy background dynamics that eventually result in the downfall of democratic government. Proponents of the gradualist interpretation are agreed with the catastrophists that democracy is largely to be understood as popular self-government based on the periodic election of representatives. They also agree with the catastrophists that the demise of democracy happens when there are serious breakdowns of consensus within the high-level institutions of government. But they want to say, to paraphrase Marx, that democide happens because it is chosen by political actors in political circumstances not of their choosing. Critically important, runs the argument, are the bitter contest between political forces favoring the maintenance and reform of the democratic system, and on the other hand, saboteurs who don't care a fig about its fate or who actively yearn for the overthrow of democracy. The explanation notes that political dynamics are normally stormy, they are often terrifying and radically confusing and always riddled with uncertainty. Paralyzed by unsolved problems, the democratically elected government grows unpopular. There are loud calls for its resignation. And in the end, things come to the boil. The moment of denouement arrives. The forces of disorder, the enemies of democracy take heart. Fierce tussles, violent protests, bomb blasts bring matters to the boil. As the government totters, the army moves from its barracks onto the streets to quell unrest and take control. The slow motion drama stops, democracy is buried in the grave. It's slowly dug for itself. There is a third interpretation of how democracies die, and I want simply to refer to this as populism and its demagogues. It's a more election-centered variant of the gradualist explanation of democide. It emphasizes that dismantling of democracy can happen when a democratically elected populist government strategically manipulates and cunningly wrecks the institutions of democracy. I have tried to write about this process in the book, The New Despotism, which was published in 2020. It looks at such cases as Hungary and Kazakhstan, Turkey, Singapore, to show that ballots can be used to ruin democracy just as effectively as bullets. Ballots, not just bullets. This transformation of a power-sharing democracy into a strangely despotic form of what I call phantom democracy can be completed, the evidence suggests, in not much more than a decade. Again, there is a different tempo. The transformation typically happens in fits and starts. At first, gradually, in slow motion, then it gathers pace. Lentissimo gives way to prestissimo. The turbulence, typically coordinated, inspired, and led by demagogues, populist, function as populist saboteurs of democratic governing arrangements. These demagogues use free and fair elections, and in the name of democracy, heap great damage on its institutions and its spirits. This, of course, is a very old process that was recognized and much discussed in the ancient Greek world, where demagogues generated excitement and fear as misleaders of the people. Misleaders of the people. That's Moses Finley, the Oxford scholar's phrase. According to this view, applied to the case of up to 100 democracies in the ancient Greek world, pointed out that democracies had something of an autoimmune disease about them. In the name of the people, leaders could appear who would abuse their power, would display their love of power, who would attract flatterers and followers, who would attract sycophants, a word which in classical Greek refers to someone who speaks in support of the demagogue and does so by accusing the enemies of the demagogue of corruption, and thereby earns money to themselves. Literally, the word sycophant is a word that describes someone who shakes fig trees to bear the fruit. Unsurprisingly, Athens and other democracies were aware of the dangers of demagoguery, and they invented a number of mechanisms for dealing with them. Among my favorite examples are ostracism. What a good idea to send a demagogue, have an annual election, and to send a demagogue into exile for some years. They also practiced public scrutiny of officials, and they had laws like grapha paranomon, it was called, which prevented citizens from tabling badly formulated motions which contravened existing laws. We know that from the time of the French Revolution, demagoguery plagued the age of electoral democracy. I've written about Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina, who was in the 1820s and 1830s, a perfect example of this transformation of a kind of electoral constitutional government into something other. This period of electoral democracy, stretching back to the French Revolution, runs right through to the 1930s. Think of Huey Long, the demagogue from the American South. And it continues, I want to say, in this era of what I call monitory democracy. Demagoguery, populism, is an autoimmune disease of democracy. What happens is that through power struggles, you know these dynamics very well, leaders appear who take advantage of the public rights of assembly and association and media freedoms to spread their message. These demagogues are specialists in the arts of political seduction. They're actually false friends of democracy. Typically, they head up a tightly disciplined political party that claims to have a hotline to the people. Demagogues set out to win elections. Millions of disgruntled people find their promises attractive. With luck and determination, with opposition parties in disrepute, electoral victory comes the way of the demagogue. There's joy in the streets. For millions, victory in the name of the people is sweet. The demagogue is delighted. Winning office tempts the government to move more quickly, to outflank and politically crush its opponents by wrapping its octopoid tentacles around the throat of the state. The civil service, the legislature, courts, and other key institutions are kidnapped slowly but surely. The powers of local government are curtailed. The big boss leader carries on stirring up talk of democracy and the people. Along the way, building a spoils system to reward friends and punish enemies. There are stern warnings about the imminent collapse of law and order, backed by the police, army, and intelligence agencies, helped along by rubber bullets, water cannon, and a few whiffs of tear gas. The government of the people begins to crack down on protesters. The pace of change quickens. Elective despotism prevails. That phrase, elective despotism, was Thomas Jefferson's. That is to say, elections begin to resemble rowdy plebiscites. Politics is no longer give and take bargaining and good-natured compromise. Politics degenerates into spectacles, dirty tricks, and vote harvesting by a government led by a demagogue messiah. Ruling by cheating, the phrase of Andras Sayo, the grand redeemer, promises the people wellness and rewards. It raises expectations that the sovereign people are entitled to expect improvements in their daily lives. They promise solutions to the local headaches and the heartbreaks of joblessness, inflation, dysfunctional transport systems, and poor healthcare. Pork barrel politics thrives. Winning the hearts of loyal followers is a priority. There are offerings of material gifts, as in the month prior to this year's Hungarian elections, where Viktor Orbán's government reportedly spent around 3% of GDP on payments to targeted voters, including big bonuses to 70,000 members of the army and the police, tax refunds to nearly 2 million employees, and an extra month's benefits to 2.5 million pensioners. Every other populist trick in the book is played. Threats and bribes in backroom meetings, dinner deals with business oligarchs, court victories, state-of-the-art media, dog whistling, and message bombing, calculated silence and brute force. The point is to suck life from power-sharing democracy committed. Oh yeah, okay, good. I've been silencing myself for nearly half an hour. I'm sorry. The point is to suck power from life from power-sharing democracy committed to the principle of equality. Elections in this dynamic of populism and demagogues, elections soon become more than elections. They're turned into elections without democracy. They become public rituals and carnivals of political seduction, celebrations of the mighty power of the state endorsed by the votes of millions of people. But as the transition away from democracy gathers pace, something more startling happens. And to this idea, I'm indebted to Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright, because what happens in the hands of the ruling party and its despot leader, there is an attempt to redefine who the people are. Desperate to tighten their grip on state power, eyes on the next election, the governing party plays filthy and stops at nothing. It hits hard against its targeted enemies. The government spreads uncivil language. It picks political fights with its opponents. It tightens border controls, builds barbed wire fences against foreigners and foreign influences. There's lots of lying, a kind of lying that promotes dirty togetherness, as Adam Podgorowski, the Polish sociologist, once described it. But the signature tactic in this process is stirring up trouble about who counts as the people. The demagogues peddle fears of enemies within. They move to ostracize people who are deemed not to belong to the real people, Donald Trump, Poles of a worse sort, Kaczynski, and people who are not real Hungarians, Orban, are warned. The great redeemer repeats and repeats again that the government enjoys the backing of an authentically sovereign people. But winning elections means creating a new people, a pasteurized people who, it said, are the true foundations of a true democracy ruled by a true leader whose strength comes from the true people. It is as if elections are turned upside down. It's Alice in Wonderland. The government votes in the people. And so the process of democide is complete. The butterfly of democracy becomes the caterpillar of a weird new kind of phantom democracy. The end result isn't old-fashioned tyranny or military dictatorship, or describable as a single ruler horror show the ancients called autocracy. It mustn't be confused with 20th century fascism or totalitarianism. The outcome is despotic, a new type of strong mafia state, as Balint Magyar, the Hungarian sociologist, calls it, led by a demagogue and run by state and corporate oligarchs with the help of pliant journalists and docile judges, a top-down form of government backed by the combined force of the fist and the voluntary servitude of millions of loyal subjects prepared to lend their votes to leaders who offer them material benefits and daringly rule in their hallowed name. Fourth interpretation, and nearing the conclusion of what I want to say, is that there is a fourth cluster of accounts of democide that concentrate on civil society. In quick-paced and more gradual tempos, high-level political games of thrones and populist demagoguery have ruinous effects on free and fair elections, competitive political parties, parliaments, courts, and other institutions of democracy, I think you can see from what I have said so far. But experience should teach us that democracies can die in still other ways, more slowly, more gradually than the state-centric explanations that I've so far talked about have surmised. The great weakness of the sudden death and the gradualist explanations is their neglect of the civil society foundations on which any given democracy rests and which democracies neglect at their own peril. In recent decades, this importance of civil society has rather been underemphasized in the literature. Sometimes it appears only as an afterthought, as it does, for example, in Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's How Democracies Die bestseller. This book, it seems to me, understates the point that democracy is much more than high-level dynamics centered on parties, elections, legislatures, and so on. The point here is that state institutions always rest upon and draw their strength from interactions among millions of people living their daily lives in a variety of mediated social settings that stretch from family households, personal friendships, local communities, through to their workplaces, sporting and leisure venues, and places of worship. This point was central in the work of my doctoral supervisor, someone of whom you may not have heard. This is C.B. McPherson, Bruff McPherson, a student of Harold Lasky, who spent a lifetime pointing out that democracy is a kind of society. It's a whole way of life committed to the principle that people considered as equals can make the best of themselves. The cultivation of social relations, seen in this way, is a necessary condition of the development of individual capacities, as McPherson wrote. The maximization of democracy, his phrase, requires that citizens enjoy the absence of impediments, an adequate means of life, and protection against invasions by others. When seen in this way, normatively speaking, democracy is a whole way of life, a special form of social interaction and self-realization in which people from different walks of life rub shoulders, see eye to eye, cooperate and compromise, generally think of themselves as the equals of each other. This means that the self-government of the people through their chosen representatives can happen only when citizens live together non-violently in various social associations and communities and treat each other as equals worthy of respect and dignity. Put differently, democracy from this perspective, this fourth perspective, is much more than attending local public meetings, keeping up with breaking news, or voting. A well-functioning democracy requires freedom from violence, hunger, and personal humiliation. Democracy is saying no to child slavery. It is saying no as well to callous employers who maltreat workers as mere commodities, who deny them the right to form independent trade unions. Democracy is jobs that bring satisfaction and sufficient reward to live comfortably. It's the rejection of racism, misogyny, caste and religious bigotry, and all other types of human and non-human indignity. Democracy is humility. It's the willingness to admit the impermanent, that impermanence renders all life vulnerable, that in the end nobody is invincible, and that ordinary lives are never ordinary. Democracy is free access to information and a learned sense of worldly wonder. It's the everyday ability to handle unexpected situations and to make judgments wisely. It's the friend of contingency. It's the refusal of the dogma that things can't be changed because they're naturally fixed in stone. Democracy thus implies the need periodically for insurrection, the refusal to put up with everyday forms of idolatry and bullying, snobbery and toad-eating lies and bullshit and other forms of social degradation. But now the question, what happens to a power-sharing democracy when governments, businesses and citizens allow its social footings to be damaged or destroyed? Well, a set of replies to this question is offered in a book I did just last year with an Indian co-author. It's called To Kill a Democracy. Its basic idea is that one should look at the destructive feedback loops between social degradation on the one side and the annihilation of democratic governing institutions on the other. This destruction of democracy by means of the degradation of social life is a slow road to democide. And what we say in this book, which it seems to me applies to other contexts, is that when governments, businesses, and other organizations allow civil society to undergo decomposition, then a series of defeats of the spirit and substance of democracy happens. It takes time for this to happen. One can see this dynamic unfolding in India after a generation of a transition from empire to a republic, a transition that has given birth to a kind of degraded society that was never properly supported and has produced, of course, demagogues, not just Narendra Modi, but others within the provinces of India. What happens is the contradiction between a degraded civil society and democratic ideals and institutions should be clear. Immediately, when civil society degrades, when it begins to decompose, this contradicts the high-minded legal ideals of democratic constitutions. They may promise liberty, equality, justice, and dignified solidarity, but these become meaningless phrases. Citizens empirically come to be gripped by a sense of legal powerlessness and cynicism towards a judiciary that itself becomes vulnerable to attacks on juristocracy, as Erdogan calls it, happens. Massive imbalances of wealth, widespread violence, famine, unevenly distributed life chances also make a mockery of the ethical principle that in a democracy, people can live as citizen partners of equal social worth. Social suffering renders that democratic principle utterly utopian or turns it into a grotesque farce, as many people and poorer citizens have concluded in today's Tunisia. Inadequate diet, rotten healthcare, opioid drug addiction, hazardous living conditions disable and kill citizens. That is a direct assault on the ethos of democracy. Feelings of social worthlessness destroy people's dignity. Indignity is a form of generalized social violence. Nobody, not even well-educated people with good jobs and assets, escapes its clutches. When this happens, everybody suffers, unevenly to be sure, rich and poor alike. Ground down by social indignity, the powerless are robbed of self-esteem. No doubt, there can be millions of mutinies. They can happen under these conditions. But citizens tend, when this degradation of civil society happens, it reaches a point where citizens are reduced to subjects who are forced to accept everyday bossing and bullying, to put up with restrictions on basic public freedoms, to get used to big money, surveillance, police killings, and soldiers on the streets. But the slow road to democide doesn't happen there. It doesn't end there. For when large numbers of citizens suffer social indignities, governments are in effect granted a license to rule arbitrarily. Starved of time, resources, self-respect, humiliated people become sitting ducks. They subject themselves to resignation or cynical disaffection. There is a lot of bellyaching. But they also, under these conditions, may well, in large numbers, begin to yearn for political redeemers and steel-fisted government. This is the moment at which the demagogue comes onto the scene. This is the Mexican painter Orozco. This is a 1946, it's cut out, it's a 1946 image of the demagogue. Citizens filled with what the French call ressentiment begin to be attracted to leaders. They choose, as it were, their servitude by being attracted to leaders who exploit public grievances and disappointments. You can see this dynamic going on under President Kais Saied in Tunisia today. But the hubris of messiahs has serious costs, because as I've already mentioned, when democratically elected governments cease to be held accountable to a civil society broken and weakened by inequalities of wealth and so on, joblessness, poor healthcare, it tends to encourage those demagogues to make careless, foolish, and incompetent decisions. Something like what I call institutional democracy failure happens. Civil society begins to be crushed by the state, cheered on by lapdog media, strong-armed rule by rich and powerful business tycoons and populist messiahs, flourishes. Phantom democracy becomes the new reality. And finally, I want to speak about the slowest form of democide, and I want to suggest to you, in a field of inquiry where this is not very much talked about still, I want to suggest to you that the slowest form of democide, a kind of political sleepwalking, should be the most worrying for democracies. The argument goes something like this. Democracy dies a slow motion death not only when citizens endure such indignities as domestic violence, poor healthcare, religious and racial bigotry, gun crimes, daily shortages of food and housing. Democracies play dice with their disappearance. They risk democide when citizens and their representatives succumb to human thoughtlessness and inaction. When, in other words, they blindly ignore not only the anti-democratic effects of unusual weather events, species extinctions, pestilences, and other environmental emergencies, but also when they fail to see that democracy, the most anthropocentric political form known to humanity, I submit, will have no future unless its ideals and practices are rid of the deep-seated prejudice that we humans live outside a nature whose dynamics are administratively controllable and commercially exploitable for the use and enjoyment of the people. Making sense of the anti-democratic effects of what Amitav Ghosh, the Indian writer, calls a great derangement, initially requires frank encounters with many worrying symptoms. Growing numbers of warning signs are beginning to surface. It is as if these symptoms that I'm about to describe are Earth's revenge against its human destroyers. These environmental shocks are marked by frightening quantum qualities that display a will of their own. You know them well. Huge bushfires that burn uncontrollably through fields and forests, spitting black ash and illuminating nighttime skies with flickers of blood orange light. Heat waves so extreme that roads and railway tracks buckle and melt. Severe droughts, atmospheric river-driven megastorms that cause extensive flooding, polluted and diseased water, landslides and large-scale drowning and displacement of people. Such fast-paced convulsions are disruptive, and they usually are given much more media coverage than the slower motion, often invisible but equally damaging ruination of our environments. Think of the looming silent spring insect apocalypse caused by enforced habitat loss, pesticide-heavy farming, invasive species, and global warming. A recent study shows that flying insects alone in the United Kingdom have declined 60% during the past 2 decades. This is a slow motion destruction of the bio foundations of any given democracy. Or consider the irreversible damage that's done to seasonal migration patterns, predator-prey food chains, and nesting and breeding habits of species by temperature stress, storm surges, increased evaporation, and acidification of lakes and oceans. Silent, invisible, unpredictable transmissions of zoonotic viruses of the kind that we've just experienced. The list in the slow lane is already long and growing fast. These multi-rhythm eco-trends potentially destroy democracy, despite the greening of politics that has been taking place during my lifetime. What I want to say is that one of the dangers, one of the ways in which democracy dies, is that the newly invented monitoring institutions that arose during the past generation can themselves be destroyed. I'm thinking of citizen science projects, coral reef monitoring networks, green think tanks, bioregional assemblies, Earthwatch summits, global bio-agreements such as the Aarhus Convention, Zadist-style occupations, efforts to legally grant rights to patches of fields and forests and rivers, as in New Zealand. All of these innovations described by Bruno Latour, who sadly passed away just 2 days ago. He called them parliaments of things. All of them are made vulnerable by this destruction of our bio foundations. They undermine democracy indirectly. So to say, by destroying the institutions that are designed to protect them. If democracy, as Latour once remarked, is, quote, even more fragile than the ecosystems of a coral reef, then coral reef monitoring networks will surely lose their raison d'etre when the bleaching and death of a whole reef happens. But that's not all. There are other, more immediately observable anti-democratic effects of the despoliation of our planet. Citizens suffer injury and death. Weather-related disasters have increased fivefold, the evidence is, during the past half century, and are now on average robbing 115 people of their lives each day, somewhere on our planet. They fear for their lives. Survivors are quarantined, told to keep their distance from others, dragged and pushed from their dwellings and habitats, supervised by police and army and emergency service units. Yes, in these emergency settings, opal-hearted citizens do their best to cope with disasters. Food and clothing are shared. For instance, during lockdown, pots and pans are banged. There are songs of solidarity. But disasters, as we know from Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian War, disasters, as he described the typhus plague that hit Athens and that killed nearly a third of the citizens of democratic Athens, disasters of this kind can produce very nasty effects, a greater lawlessness, as Thucydides put it. I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that contemporary catastrophes have similar effects, even on a much larger scale. The most extreme weather events so far recorded last month in Pakistan shows how quickly the tapestry and the tissues and threads of trust and cooperation of civil society can be torn apart by greed and corruption, fear and sickness. During extreme environmental shocks, compulsory solidarity, Leszek Kolakowski, a type of solidarity degraded by its coercive imposition, is standardized. Among the grave dangers of these episodes of emergency rule that we're witnessing is the stickiness of concentrated arbitrary power. As temporary measures, lockdowns and the banning of boycotts and public assembly easily become permanent arrangements. Power granted is power conceded, and power relinquished is power reclaimed with difficulty. Emergency rule, in other words, gets people used to subordination. It's the mother of voluntary servitude. In this dynamic, democracy becomes its own worst enemy. Despotism becomes potentially the future of democracy. But there's one other casualty of these processes of environmental degradation. The casualty is among the least obvious, but the deepest effects of ecological disasters. It's the way, slowly but invisibly, they destroy the ethos, the living customs of democracy. If you read, for example, Albert Camus' The Plague, or if you read José Saramago, the Portuguese novelist's Blindness, you will see the way that they explore the dynamics in which a pestilence undermines public virtues and brings out the very worst in humanity. The point applies, I would say, to all eco-disasters, fast and slow. Exactly because they cut deeply into the biomes in which people dwell, these disasters prove more disruptive and tragic than the uncivil strife pictured in Hobbes' infamous state of nature. Under our conditions, humans are flung into the deepest possible liminality. Even the biomes in which they dwell can't anymore be taken for granted. Ruination can be total. Fauna and flora are destroyed. Animals are maimed and bewildered by their loss of habitat. I can tell you from the fires that we experienced in Australia 2 summers ago, that the rate of bottom-up species destruction accelerates under these conditions. The chances of total ecosystem collapse escalate. Not even the native worms, spiders, grasshoppers, and other tiny creatures that dwell humbly and honorably at the base of our local biomes are safe, nor are humans. Fair-minded equality is replaced by what one could call biometric rivalries, each for themselves, sauf qui peut, rich against poor, strong against weak, indifference, aggression, or outright hostility towards others flourishes. Fair burden sharing, so vital for democracy, as the German scholar Wolfgang Merkel has recently pointed out, is thrown out the window. Environmental injustice, unequal access to air, water, sun, shade becomes the new normal. A democratically shared sense of wellness in the world is destroyed. So are aesthetic virtues that have an elective affinity with the customs and practices of power-sharing monitory democracy. This is Rachel Carson, who warned that one of the consequences of long-term environmental degradation would be the destruction of the ethic of wonder, an ethic which she considered to be vital for any vibrant democracy. There are other effects, such as the word solastalgia. It's a neologism coined by an Australian thinker, Glenn Albrecht, to describe the kind of melancholy, the sadness, the sense of insecurity, the feeling of powerlessness that comes when environmental calamities destroy biomes in which one felt previously at home. Pani I Panovi and Obyvateli, I want to end by, because I'm getting the wind-up note, I want to end with just a few short remarks about democracy as self-restraint. This scholar, you may have come across Norbert Elias, once observed that the political form known as democracy functionally requires a much higher degree of self-restraint than any other known political form. His idea was that when millions of people live together, non-violently and compromise, learn to live with each other, to share power, that this is a kind of civilizational leap. And his point was that any given territorial democracy requires a high degree of self-restraint of actors encouraged by institutions, a high degree of self-restraint. Well, I've tried to make this argument as well in a book called Power and Humility, and I'm going to summarize my conclusion in a very quick way by saying that democide, slow and fast, the dynamics that I've been describing in the last hour can be seen as the triumph of power unchained. That is, the unrestrained exercise of power by a few over people and the biomes in which they dwell. The sudden snuffing out of democracy by a military coup d'etat, the gradual dismantling of self-government, sometimes by demagogues acting in the name of the people, and the social violence inflicted upon citizens by rich and powerful oligarchs are examples of the multiple ways in which democide happens. But there's another type of runaway arbitrary power that can damage and destroy democracy. When citizens and representatives of any given political order avowedly committed to democracy fail to exercise prudent self-restraint in their encounters with the biosphere, then my thesis is they are asking for trouble. Democracy suffers self-harm. That is to say, by tolerating extinction events, planetary warming, the acidification of our oceans, the axing of whole forests, democracy, to repeat, plays dice with its own disappearance. Well, when seen in this revised way, the foes of democracy include not only army generals, backstabbing political operators, populist demagogues, and wealthy power-loving oligarchs, because it turns out that the most dangerous enemies of democracy are individuals, groups, and institutions who are living in denial, power wielders who stick to their scripts and pull up their drawbridges, who suppose in the name of democracy that they can bluff their way through the world for another few decades. One other implication of this revised way of thinking about how democracy dies, I end on this note, it transpires that institutionalist, narrow state-centered accounts of democide belong to the same paradigm, to a mode of thinking that is of declining relevance and incapable of grasping the ways in which democracies can be gradually destroyed by the intersection of social deprivation and environmental ignorance and decay. The point is that democracy is much more than pressing a button or marking a box on a ballot paper. It goes beyond the mathematical certitude of election results and majority rule. It's not reducible to lawful rule through independent courts or attending public meetings and watching breaking news stories scrolled across a screen. Guided by the spirit of equality and the refusals of predatory power, democracy is a whole way of life whose delicate geosocial foundations are ignored or neglected at its peril. Democracy dies a slow motion death, democide in the very slow rhythm of adagissimo, not only when citizens suffer such indignities as domestic violence, poor healthcare, religious and racial bigotry. Democracies also destroy themselves when these same citizens and their representatives forget that extreme weather events, pestilences, and other environmental emergencies breed power grabs, and the democracy won't have a future unless its ideals and practices are democratized by extending the democratic principles of self-restraint and humility to our relations with what used to be called nature. Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much.
It works.
Okay, so thank you. So it is, I think it's very difficult to have a voice after John Keane. So I will do my best. But first of all, okay, so why I'm here? So I'm national coordinator, like a Polish leader of European Social Survey. And in this round of European Social Survey, we asked a battery of questions about democracy. So the questions were related to the normative expectations about democracy. What is important? What aspects of democracy? What aspects of functioning the state are important for democracy? And also how given aspects are evaluated by respondents. Yeah, and what I would like to, so this module is kind of like, it's like a part of the broader project led by Hans-Peter Griesien, Monika Ferin, and also Radek Markowski is involved in it. So these questions were repeated. First were asked in the European Social Survey in 2012, and right now it was repeated. So we are just after finishing the field work, and I have very fresh data. They are not published yet. They will be published end of November, but I managed to look at it, and I have some initial results which I can share with you. So so after this like broad view, however, with many empirical references. I will go to the earth. What's going on in Poland these days? So what is, I would say, the most surprising thing about in these results is that supporters for party which is perceived as illiberal or is responsible for democratic backsliding, so they still perceive themselves as Democrats. They still declare that it's important for them to live in democracy. So, and they are satisfied with the way how democracy is functioning in general, and also in when particular aspects of democracy are evaluated. So at least in declarations, so it's still like quoting Adam Przeworski, that democracy is like the only game in town, at least in terms of rhetoric. So maybe this is this gradual process, if something happened here, or these populists and demagogues who were elected using the democratic rules, but still democracy is not neglected as such. However, there are some differences. So when there is questions, so how important is for you to live in democracy? So average value for like law and justice supporters is 8.9 on the scale from 0 to 10. 8.9, this is average value for law and justice supporters. For the main opposition platform, main opposition party civic platform, it is 9.7. So it was 8.9, 9.7. So, and this difference is statistically significant. So then there is some difference. However, still voters of Law and Justice Party are still declare that for them democracy is like it's important to live in democratic country. However, what differs Polish voters, Polish citizens in this matter? So actually, is the meaning of democracy. So what's the content of democracy? What is important for democracy? And for voters of opposition parties, they more often than others they mention free elections and rights of minorities as essential issues of the essential characteristics of democracy. Then supporters of Law and Justice Party, the ruling party, they have a bit different. So they differ in this way that for them more important than for others were such issues like courts treating everyone the same way, protection from poverty, reduces differences in income levels. So actually not procedures, but outcomes of democracy. So we have many traces in your lecture about connected to it. So this thing is kind of somehow similar. So what early researchers of Polish democracy from the beginning of 90s, as like Janusz Rejkowski, who what was found by them. So one of the findings was that it was part from the qualitative interviews that people said. I remember this quotation that citizens said at the time that we like democracy, we like to have democracy because we would like to have situations such as in Western Germany, when they have cars, when they have in stores, when they have products in store that could afford for it. And yes, so here these outcome elements are kind of important for people supporting of a Polish ruling party. So it's like in a nutshell the most like a striking very initial findings, and we'll work on this data later and it will be more elaborated, but just like I have some few elements. But also I would like to say thank you for this excellent lecture, and with so broad view and so many references. So we have some also, and especially for me, like very inspirational thing is this including these environmental issues in discussion about democracy. So, and as an empirical scholar on democracy, I would be happy to include some environmental elements in studying the perception of democracy and like satisfaction and other aspects. So as I would like to end in that way, that there is like famous quote, I don't know who said it, but the quote is, "Nothing is such practical as good theory." So for us as practical researchers, for me, this lecture was very inspirational and it was very practical. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we have approximately half an hour for discussion. The floor is now yours. You can comment, ask questions, and whatever other interventions, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you use the mic or it's okay? Thank you. My name is Zbyszek Dzideczek, Gebo Foundation. Thank you for such, excuse me? For such beautiful and fantastic lecture. I would say is more lesson for me because you point out some difficulties, but title of your lecture was very provocative. How democracies die means for me is democracy is like a statement that democracies are dying. Problem is time. So my question is connected with the second part of your lesson. What next? What will be after when democracy will die? Never mind today, tomorrow, or after 20 years. So what is your opinion? What is your idea? Which direction the world is going? First, to kill democracy. Second, what's happened when democracy, we will be on the cemetery, we will be on, the democracy will be already in the box.
Thank you, it's clear. Now we'll collect maybe a few more and then, okay?
I think I said much too much, so I'm very much looking forward.
Okay. So please,
thank you very much. I have two questions. You dealt much with the question of power relations and the relation between power and the society. It was a little less present, the question of technology and technological development. Why this is not an innocent factor in the development of the political systems. And this is very tricky influence as far as I see the question of technology. So I'd like to comment you on that, but I think that technology on the one hand finds somewhat better ambience in democratic systems to develop. And the economic system, the economic initiative, and thus the technology development goes better in democracies. That's the hope. Sometimes international confrontation on the technological side happens during the wartime. And it's quite crucial factor for the future of democracies. And on the other hand, technology also brings new incentives to social inequalities. It might be very likely to be used in terms of biggering social inequalities, plus new concentration of the power. So this is somewhat anti-democratic. So I'd like to have you to see your point. How does it relate to the general question of the future of democracy? And the second short question is that to what extent the question of climate change and the relationship between human being and nature is directly addressed to democracy, and to what extent it is a deeper nature of the human being itself. While the question is whether we are able to see the perspective in longer term, and to be whether are we able to impose ourselves certain restrictions, as Elias said, and to what extent it's more likely in democracies and non-democracies.
Okay, thank you, Michał. Yeah. Professor Słomczyński.
I like your presentation very much, but the picture which you painted is very pessimistic, in a sense that you presented the system of democracy as defenseless without proper immune system. My question is, do you see any way in which democracy can defend itself by democratic, but also by non-democratic means? Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Sobie.
Robert Sobie, I would like to continue, so the way of thinking of Professor Słomczyński, because it was very comprehensive, interesting lecture, but very gloomy one. And my question is, do you see any changes for this dying process, or maybe not the changes, but the kind of the cure? And specifically, so I'm curious about your vision of birth or rebirth of democracy. And if you could answer the question whether you see any chances for the birth or rebirth democracy in Russia, in current Russia.
Thank you. Mikołaj Cześnik.
Well, I also would like to thank you for the presentation. And my question again follows, probably follows this idea. I really like your idea of democracy as a society, as a type of society. And when I think about democracy as a type of society, it brings, well, at least to me, to my mind, the two concepts of Ferdinand Tönnies, the Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. Now, the idea, my question would be, what kind of ties would you see within democracy? Is it warmer as Gemeinschaft, or is it colder and more rational, less emotional? So is it a kind of Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft? And does it have any impact on the endurance of democracy? For me, well, I have certain expectations, but I am more interested in your point of view. No, actually, I think that the Gemeinschafts are stronger, more stable, and this is, according to Tönnies, something that is basically more stable and should survive easier than something that is more rational than Gesellschaft, basically. So maybe our problem is quite old and goes back to Tönnies, or even, yeah, but I am interested in your point of view, not Tönnies. Thank you.
I'm wondering whether this is not enough for the first phase. Would you like to address now, or shall we continue with questions?
Shall I stay?
Okay, so
I would go.
I think next the microphone to the person in dark beard.
Jacek Mazurczak, Institute of Philosophy and Sociology. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. Actually, I have a very similar questions to Professor Słomczyński's one. I am wondering if just from practical side, let's say, because you've mentioned the issue of equivalence between demagogists, populists, and this imagine of average Pole, average citizen. So my question is how to cut this equivalence between them, with what type of idea, with what type of narratives.
Okay, now. Can you summarize it?
I mean, because you during your lecture you discussed that populists are trying to say that there is a link between direct link between them and this and the figure of average citizen. So I'm wondering how we can cut this equivalence. Maybe with what type of idea, with what type of discourse, just to react somehow on this problem and cut this equivalence.
Okay, thank you. Now it goes to you.
Hello, hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about your book. Like your book, you introduce the idea of a monetary democracy and monetary democracy. So, but I kind of get like a little confused about the idea. And you give an example by referencing to the Gulliver's Travel. Gulliver's travel, like Gulliver was restrained by a bunch of homunculus. The little like a Lilliputian, and because Gulliver's travel. So I want to like, can you explain kind of how can the monetary democracy distant from be cautioned against the hierarchy of power? Thank you.
Okay, we now have questions from the audience that is outside this building. How shall we proceed? Shall they? Okay. Please go ahead. Joanna. Henrietta, I'm sorry, Henrietta.
So much. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. I see a problem with the analysis of democracy in general and with the way that governments relate to the people. On the one hand, politics is the art of the possible. On the other hand, what's required from the citizen is idealistic and maximalistic. I mean, the citizen should present self-restraint, should be ecologically minded, should be politically minded, should spot and reject demagogues and so on and so forth. Is this realistic? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have another, Joanna.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. I'd like to present myself. My name is Jan. I am the son of Joanna. I'm listening to your lecture. And I would like to tell you something about what we do in Poland. I am among the leaders of the youth movement called Federation of Young Social Democrats. And we work in order to change the mindset of people who live around us in order to bring a more democratical state and a more freedom state, the rule of law in the future. We hope to support the efforts of those who work in order to achieve this. Dear Professor, would you have any advice, any piece of advice, what we, the young people who do not yet have the tools to change the world, how to support, how to act, what actions to engage in order to preserve the democracy as we know, so that it cannot be wasted by new autocrats. I'm listening to any piece of advice that you could share.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If this is all, let me just mention three things I would love to ask you, but just to put it on the table. The first one is there is this tricky relationship between entanglement between democracy and types of capitalism, right? You sort of, this was not covered that much in your lecture, and probably I would be very happy to see how you see it. The second thing is context. You know, democracies are systems that ought to have internal equilibrium, yeah? But on the other hand, we know that democracies survive or die because of contextual factors, yeah? Like because of well, the wave of democracies, the waves of backsliding, etc. And finally, the third thing I would put on the table was You mentioned once upon a time this strong feeling that some philosophers and interpreters turn to think that democracy is natural. To what extent it is precisely, you would strongly object that democracy is created and not, because there is a powerful and strong inclination of many scholars to say that, well, democracy is somehow the best fit for humankind, for their preferences, because of freedom, because of this and that. And there is a real, yeah, I would say, discussion on whether democracy should be treated as a natural or nature doing what nature does, which some consider it to be a mistake. That would be it. So I think that that's why we have a renowned universally professor. So many questions and answers now, or comments.
Yeah. So, so to everybody for these questions, both online and live here. I apologize for giving I promised Professor Markowski I would not give a Chavez, Castro type long lecture, but it happened, and I'm sorry for that. But then you have punished me with I count 15 questions, and these are all, every one is an excellent question, and I am not sure that I can reply satisfactorily, because if I try to do that, then we will be here. We have only 15. Yeah, exactly. So I will, in some random order, try to respond to each of these points, beginning with the gloominess. I mean, this seems to me, I made myself misunderstood if you think that I was the bringer of doom and gloom, of pessimism into this room. I am not a pessimist. One reason I am not a pessimist is because pessimists are typically dogmatic. I will be speaking about this in Sopot tomorrow. Dogmatic, they know that everything is shit, everything is going downhill. This was not my presentation to you. And I am certainly not an optimist. I mean, if, so a pessimist, Oscar Wilde, the great Irish playwright, said, is someone who complains about the noise when opportunity knocks. This is a joke. An optimist is someone who I would say in these times is naive, who supposes that history is flowing in the direction of democracy. I recently reread a case in point, Fukuyama's 1989 essay, where he says the main problem facing the world will be boredom. I mean, this is the presumption was that liberal democracy, elections, constitutional government is the future, and there is not an alternative. Empirically, this has turned out to be a serious mistake. What instead I tried to do in this lecture was put to you a worst case scenarios, because it seems to me that methodologically speaking, one can learn a lot from this comparative approach in which one thinks historically, one thinks institutionally, one thinks socially and environmentally about how democracies are undermined. It is a topic, it seems to me, democide, that badly needs some revival. And it was put by Professor Richard at the beginning that there was nearly 25 years of research that concentrated on transitions to democracy. Well, that seems to me to be still very important literature. What I tried to do in this lecture was not to be gloomy and depress you, I warned you that I am not interested in death for the sake of death. I wanted instead to pinpoint in a kind of early warning detector way, to pinpoint dynamics that we should pay attention to as Democrats. If you don't like democracy, that's fine. You would welcome this lecture because it shows actually that there are at least a handful of ways to destroy the spirit and the substance of democracy. So what I wanted to do was to present to you a way of thinking about how to defend democracy. And I did mention specifically Karl Löwenstein. You may not know of him, but this was a scholar who also, to repeat, in the mid-1930s, called for democracy to become, Democrats to become militant, to pay attention to the ways that democracies can be destroyed. And that was the spirit in which I presented to you these remarks. This is one reply which I hope makes clear to one of the questioners that I don't think that there is at work a kind of negative teleology, you know, that slowly but surely through these multiple ways democracies are being destroyed and morphing into something else. I do not, on the other hand, think that the breakthroughs that have happened are guaranteed historically to survive. One way of summarizing this would be to think in quantum terms. You know, that we are living in times in which there is, so to say, a superpositioning of democracy. Superpositioning, it means that there are these negative, destructive, auto-destructive trends going on. There's also, about which I didn't speak, it's another lecture, there are lots of innovations and defenses of democracy and breakthroughs that actually never happened before in the history of democracy. What do I have in mind? I think that, for example, the struggle of women and their supporters for their dignity, for acceptance of difference. This is a process that's unfinished. It's subject to setbacks, but it is a process that in my lifetime has made tremendous gains. And another example of the superpositioning, the innovations, the breakthroughs, is the greening of democracy. That's another lecture, but it seems to me that the invention of some of the monitoring, public monitoring mechanisms that I mentioned are restricted to my lifetime. It never happened before in the history of democracy. And I even put to you the thought, it sounded like an anti-democratic remark. I put to you the thought that democracy is being redefined by these greening innovations. So what could be more anthropocentric than the belief that the people are the sovereign power on earth who can do whatever they like. They can choose whichever leaders they want and do whatever they like to the biomes in which they dwell. There is something, so to say, I choose a word carefully, there is something questionable about that presumption. And what I think the greening institutions, not just green parties, but bioregional assemblies, extinction rebellions, and so on, what they are doing is redefining democracy to mean democracy is self-government of people who think of themselves as equals, who live in biomes, who must be treated also as, so to say, their equals, and to do so through various forms of representation of rivers and animals and so on that cannot speak for themselves. I think this is enough about this. Very randomly, democracy, Turney's democracy as a form of life, should there be more Gemeinschaft and less Gesellschaft? It's a long and very interesting, it would be a very long and interesting discussion. In my own work, I'm afraid I'm disloyal. I'm disloyal to the Gemeinschaft view of democracy. Max Weber had a version of this. My view is that democracy is not only to be understood as a way of handling power within territorial states that can be bound together by a sense of nation, for instance. This is one version. But democracy has a kind of promiscuous spirit. You know, the belief that people are capable of governing themselves on earth. The belief that nobody is good enough to sit on thrones of power. The belief that power relations are not natural, that they can be changed. This, the spirit of democracy operates across borders. It operates in local communities. It operates in households, for instance. It operates potentially at the global level. So when I think about Gemeinschaft, I'm wondering why one would speak about it in the singular. One could have a strong sense of Gemeinschaft in a household, but live in a civil society where there are many different and competing understandings of what the good life is. In my own work, inspired by my young days in this part of Europe before 1989, you know, I learned the language of civil society. And it seems to me, running through the lecture today, that a civil society is not understandable in Chinese terms. That a civil society is not just individuation, selfishness, and the breakdown of solidarities. A civil society is plural, and it's a good thing for democracy if it underpins governmental institutions, elections, and so on. Normatively, it's desirable, but it is not, it's neither Gemeinschaft nor Gesellschaft as Tönnies understood it. It's something more complex and I would say more interesting. I would say one thing that it bothers me when there are efforts by governments and parties to revive a Gemeinschaft. And I think the front runner is, of course, the nation. And there's plenty of that about today. And in this respect, you know, I'm with Camus, that the problem with nationalism is that it does violence to the complexity of any given nation. His famous sentence, "I love my nation, Hans, too much to be a nationalist," is very much close to what I feel. About technology and climate change. The question of technology and democracy, it's another lecture. And the category is, of course, too abstract. There was a little suggestion of Heidegger in this, and I would love to talk about Heidegger and democracy. What I have been interested in my work, this tricky connection between technology and democracy, I've been very interested in communications technologies and the history of communications technologies and the way that they structure the dynamics of any given democracy and change the forms of democracy through time. An example, assembly democracies of the ancient Greek world were primarily the public, the agora, the public space, the paniques, where male citizens met to decide how to live on earth together in that context. The primary means of communication was orality, supplemented with some printed laws, papyrus on stone, horses and donkeys. electoral democracy, born at the end of the 18th century, is interestingly a form of democracy that rested on the printing press. And it structured the ethos and substance of democracy very differently. The Greeks did not know the printing press. They had no clocks, they had no railways, they had no printed letters, they did not have novels, etc. And I would say, in my work, I try to say that this age of monitory democracy, I have something to say about this in a moment, that was born of the 1940s, is a form of democracy which comes to mean nothing less than free and fair elections, but something much more. And something much more is that a democracy requires institutions of various kinds that scrutinize, watchdog institutions that scrutinize abuses of power. And this form of democracy is intimately bound up with the coming of digital network communications. And I would say they have this mode of this communications infrastructure has very important shaping effects on what we mean by democracy. And I noticed that among your Polish citizens, there are some who think that democracy is more than elections, and it's more than just a way of life. It's also about public scrutiny of power. I'm not sure what I can say about the deeper question of the human. I would say that democracy democratizes the human, that the human comes as a category, comes to be more time-space understood in more time-space specific terms. And I'll get myself in trouble with this, but a Democrat is someone who always is suspicious of talk of human nature, because democracy denatures human nature. We could have a long discussion about this. Are democracies better capable of dealing with environmental destruction? Are democracies capable of preventing that slowest form of democide is a hugely important question. And I think that we would have to have a discussion about the Chinese model. There is, you may know, in China, from Xi Jinping downwards, there is growing talk of the need to move towards an ecological civilization. There is an awareness that this growth model that began with Deng Xiaoping is not sustainable. But is that system, one-party system, is it capable of giving birth to a kind of greening of life, a serious addressing of environmental destruction? We are going to see. To be noted is that the huge majority of the democratic innovations that have happened in my lifetime, that we call the greening of democracy, have typically happened in the heartlands of power-sharing democracies. And that's not surprising, because when you have public assembly freedoms, it enables groups like Extinction Rebellion, or the Zaddists, to actually say that power is abusive, that this destruction of this species is a crime. That's difficult currently under Chinese conditions, but we are going to see about that dynamic.
We have to wrap up a little.
Right. What happens next? No, let me just note. Democracy and Capitalism, another lecture. It was implicit. And I have to tell you that secretly behind this lecture is the work of Karl Polanyi. It's a great work about what happens when a market system throws off all governmental regulation and begins to destroy its social foundations. That Polanyi idea was at work in this lecture. Democracy, yes, it dies in contexts. Why is democracy not natural? Because it denatures the natural, but we can talk about this much more, Professor. A question came by internet about whether all of this is realistic. Against those who think I'm pessimistic, this was a lecture about the normative conditions, strategic conditions for defending democracy. Do not allow a military coup d'etat, do not allow ugly political infighting at the top, do not allow populist demagogues to get their way, do not allow your civil society to be weakened and destroyed, do not allow democide through ecocide. The question comes, is this realistic? Well, this depends on the context, but I want only to say one thing, if I may, and I stop in 2 minutes. Democracy is a very unusual political form. Unlike socialism, of the kind that you experienced for a generation, nearly, you never get there. You never get there. There is no perfect democracy. It is always, as Derrida famously said, it's always the democracy to come. Democracy is never finished. You never get there. Always going around corners, upstairs. It's not a fully realizable ideal. It is the struggle to prevent the abuse of power wherever it happens. And this is a perennial problem. And so you can throw your hands up in the air and say it's all unrealistic. But then you make yourself the prey of the fans, the lovers.
Excuse me, could you speak a little bit louder?
Oh,
because
yes.
We almost cannot hear you. Oh, now better.
It's not deliberate. Sorry.
Much better now. Keep it up. Thank you.
Almost finished. Monitory democracy. I had memorized the Polish translation, but now I'm not going to try to make myself look stupid. I mean, the idea is that in the 1940s, if you look globally at the discussion that took place about the future of democracy, it was the last great period of that discussion. There was a consensus across the political spectrum in India, as much as in Latin America, as in Europe and North America, that democracy could no longer continue to mean exclusively free and fair elections within a territorial state. That there needed to be, because this could give rise to Hitler, there needed to be new institutions, watchdog institutions, independent courts, written constitutions, human rights networks were among the first to be born. There needed to be watchdogs to prevent the abuse of power, that is, the damaging of people's lives. And I thought for quite a number of years about what to call this, this transformation. More than 100 different types of watchdog institutions have been born since the 1940s that never existed before in the history of democracy. And it's not very good poetry, but I chose to call it monitory democracy, by which I mean that these institutions, like an independent court, keeps its eyes on the operations of power, and it seeks to restrain that power when it becomes abusive. This is the core idea of monitory democracy. How can the link between demagogues and the people be broken? Democratize the people principle. So the idea of monitory democracy is that this is an historical period where democracy comes to mean a system in which the people is seen to be a fiction. Populists try to revive that. But the democratization of the sovereign people principle is the alternative. One thinks of flesh and blood people in all of their diversity and complexity, and democracy is the defense of that complexity, of that diversity. At least it seems. This is the way to break the equivalence. What next, if I may? I was asked. Well, the lecture suggested a number of pathways. Coup d'etat, as in Thailand. It suggested that another option is demagoguery that may lead to a new kind of despotism. And this is a word that I have tried to revive. What I think is troubling about the empirical results is that everybody's still in favor of democracy. And this is historically significant. But the warning that ran through this lecture is that democracies can commit democide in the name of the people, in the name of democracy. This is one basic lesson, it seems to me, to come from this analysis. Despotism, what is it? Well, in just 30 seconds, it is an alternative, a clear alternative to power-sharing constitutional monitory democracies. It's the kind of regimes that you will find in Saudi, in Uzbekistan, in Vietnam, in Russia. It is a form of handling power that can be created democratically. This idea came from Tocqueville. If you don't get what I mean, or I'm trying to say, take a look at Orban's Hungary, take a look at Erdogan's Turkey, take a look at what is going on in Serbia, and you will find that it's possible in about a decade to transform a power-sharing constitutional monarchy democracy with a civil society into something that has Russian, Saudi, Turkish, Uzbeki qualities. What kind of regimes are these? Top-down power, concentrations of wealth at the top, periodic elections, lots of talk of the people, and lots of voluntary servitude, which is what the old term, I'm handing over, what the old 18th century term despotism tried to highlight. Despotism should worry us. It's a form of power where millions of people give themselves up, give themselves over to that power. And they do so for a variety of reasons. These regimes, I submit, this is the last sentence, are not old-fashioned autocracies. Please don't listen too much to Joe Biden. This is not a period of autocracy versus democracy. They are not old-fashioned tyrannies. I don't think they're fascist regimes. I don't think they're totalitarian. They're certainly not old-fashioned military dictatorships. There's something new and they need to be understood. And they have lots to do with the way democracies die, fast and slow.
Thank you very much again.